Hello, this is Erica Erbscorn, and I'm currently working on my ESL certification. I wanted to speak with you today just to share a little bit about some important concepts and goals related to ESL education and English language learners. These concepts are helpful for people who are familiar with English language learners or ELLs, but they're also helpful for people who may just be looking for a deeper understanding of some of those overarching concepts and kind of delving into some of the complications and some of the challenges that learning a second language, especially in a fluent English speaking school, some of the challenges related to that task. So we'll be using information that's coming from the TESOL organization, and TESOL is an acronym that stands for Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, and this is an organization that publishes a lot of resources as well as some standards related to ESL education. So the first thing that I'd like to share with you is a few of the goals or kind of the principles that guide the vision of TESOL when they're working towards effective education for English language learners. Some of these points are fairly obvious, while others of them may be things you haven't thought of before or haven't realized the importance of. So the first one for effective education for English language learners is that we want to include advanced or native-like levels of proficiency in English. That's obviously one of our goals that we work towards with our ELLs in class. So that one may be fairly obvious. One of the other principles of effective education for ELLs that isn't maybe as obvious is that we really want to include the maintenance and promotion of students' native languages in school and community contexts. And I think sometimes if you haven't looked into ESL or you haven't thought about the experience that ELLs are having in their classes, you may forget how important it is to really maintain that home language and the culture that is identified with that language. So that is one of the principles that TESOL acknowledges as being extremely important, is maintaining and promoting that native language. A third point here, all education personnel assume responsibility for the education of English language learners. And this is a very important concept. Sometimes as content teachers, I know that we can feel overwhelmed and we can feel sometimes like it's somebody else's responsibility to help English language learners. It's obviously all of our responsibility to help English language learners because that's one of the only ways that they'll succeed is by having the help and the support that they need in all of their classes and from all of their teachers. So it's very important to make sure that you as an educator stay connected and stay plugged in with your English language learners and view yourself as a very important and integral part of their education and their support. A fourth point here, we want to make sure that we provide high quality services and full access to those services and make sure that English language learners are not being limited to those resources for any reason at all. A final point here to make sure that education is effective for all students, especially English language learners, is that we need to recognize that knowledge of one language, more than one language and culture, is actually a benefit for all of us. We need to recognize that these students bring to our classrooms and to our conversations and to our lives an enrichment that would otherwise not be there. They have experiences that we don't have and we can only imagine. And typically, although there is some variation among the experiences people in a given classroom will have, typically mainstream American students, we have a lot of similar experiences. And so knowledge of more than one language and culture can be an extreme benefit for the entire class. And when the English language learner is comfortable, it will be important and it can be extremely beneficial to allow that student to show other students some of the differences in cultures and some of the experiences that they've had that are very different than our mainstream American experiences. A couple of general principles about language acquisition. I thought this was important because many of us don't have the training in language processes that we really need to properly support English language learners. So these were a few key points that I thought were helpful in starting your mind just in thinking about language as a concept and some of the principles of language. So the first thing to realize is that language is functional. It's used for a purpose, and that can change how and when and why we use it. Language also varies. It is deeply tied to culture, so language learning involves cultural learning as well. Language acquisition is also a long-term process. Sometimes we wish, if you've ever tried to learn another language, I know you've wished that you could just snap your fingers and suddenly know the entire language, all the ins and outs, and never open your mouth and make a fool of yourself. But it is a long-term process, and we need to keep that in mind and keep that patience at the forefront, especially with our students who are learning English. It's a long-term process. It's not going to be completed in a few months or even a couple of years. It takes up to 5 years or sometimes even longer to really acquire the language, especially in the academic context. So it is a long-term process. Another aspect of language is that truly acquiring a language occurs through meaningful interaction and challenging content. So this is important for content teachers because you want to make sure that the support you're giving, the activities you're giving, the assessments, all of your instruction is centered in meaningful interaction and meaningful, challenging content. If students can easily see through the value of what they're doing in the classroom, then it greatly decreases the motivation of students to acquire that language and really put themselves into it and invest in it. Another thought here is language processes develop interdependently. The language processes we're thinking of here, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, they are interrelated. Certain activities will focus on one more heavily than the other, but the truth is that they are all related, and we need to keep that in mind. Native language proficiency contributes to second language acquisition. This is important because if you're getting a student, and I'm thinking here particularly of elementary school, who may not be well developed in their first language, that can affect their ability to develop English as a second language. On the other hand, if they're a little older and they have a more solid understanding of their native language, they can actually transfer some of the concepts into their learning of English, so that can actually be beneficial. Bilingualism is an individual and societal asset. So we need to keep that in mind. That goes along with the vision of TESOL, that we want to maintain that native language, because if you think about our business world and you think about international relations and all the international traveling and companies with different branches in different countries, there's a lot of value in having that bilingualism to draw on. And so we need to teach that as an asset, we need to view that as an asset, and we need to make sure that we support that development. The last thing I'd like to share with you today are a few ideas that TESOL gives us about language proficiency in an academic setting. So this is important for our content teachers because you are in an academic setting all day, every day, working with students, and so these concepts will apply to you. Language proficiency is an outgrowth of cumulative experiences both inside and outside of school. So we talked about that when we talked about how ESL students are coming from another culture, and so they bring a host of new experiences to the table for us to use. And so it's important to know that when they're learning language, they're going to be drawing on and reflecting on their experiences inside and outside of school, and they need to be acquiring language in all kinds of different experiences inside and outside of school. That's where they're really going to benefit the most and learn the most of their language. Language proficiency can reflect complex thinking when linguistic complexity is reduced and support is present. This is one of the most difficult concepts to wrap your mind around as a content teacher, but it's one of the most important. And the idea is that just because English language learners are not able to express their understanding and their thinking in the kind of eloquent and elevated vocabulary and sentence structure that we might expect, it doesn't mean that they are not thinking at an extremely deep level, and it doesn't mean that they are not capable of thinking through complex things. So it's very important for us to realize that when we modify our assignments in an appropriate way based on our students' language proficiency level, the goal behind that and the idea behind that is that we'll be able to reduce the linguistic complexity of our tasks that we're giving them, and then we'll be able to support them. And when they have both of those things, they'll be able to show us the true level of their thinking, which it could be very complex, or it might not be that complex, but we really need to get to a place where they can express that thinking level and it's not dependent on their language abilities. A third point here, both social and academic language proficiencies are necessary for school success. And this is where we get into talking about taking about 2 years for students to acquire that social language, and then it takes 5 years or more, research indicates, to have that academic language. And the truth is that both of those are needed in the classroom setting. So often teachers may hear students conversing and think, well, that student is an English language learner, but listen how they talk to their classmates. They're clearly doing fine. They know English. They don't really need my help. They don't really need support. But the truth is that even if they have that social acquisition, they really do need some of that support because academic language is much more challenging, and both of them are necessary for school success. The fourth point here, academic language proficiency works in tandem with academic achievement. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, that as they acquire more language proficiency, then we should see that reflected in their academic achievement. The fifth point, academic language proficiency is developed through sustained content-based language instruction. This is where we get into making sure that we don't give English language learners different or lesser content than we give to other students, because that's where we talk about inequity when you're doing that. We want to make sure that it is the same content. It needs to be as sustained, as rigorous in access to that content, but it needs to be adjusted in a way that allows English language learners both to access it and both to demonstrate their skills and knowledge with it. So those are a few things that I thought might be helpful for you, just to introduce the idea of language in the classroom and all the things that are going on with English language learners as they're attempting to face, a school where they don't even speak the language, or they don't speak the language very well. And school is stressful enough for students who are fluent in the language. It's still difficult sometimes to get the content and socially to navigate school, and I can only imagine what it would be like having to do that without full acquisition of the language of instruction. So we need to have a great deal of grace and a great deal of patience, and we need to be willing to take some extra steps to help our ESL students. And I hope that some of the information in here has given you some ideas, even if it's just a shift in your thinking, in how much you value some of the things like multiculturalism and bilingualism. If you can exhibit that change, that shift in focus, and show that you value some of those things and be intentional in that, even that is a great shift in the right direction. So remember that each of us are language teachers for our English language learners, and that we need to support them the very best that we can.